Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. We have a huge episode today, a lot to cover in the geopolitical space as China doubles down on military threats. It's a heavy episode, but it needs to be covered. Let's jump in. And first up, in an unusual move, General Secretary Xi Jinping initiated a phone call with US President Donald Trump on yesterday, a gesture that immediately drew attention in Beijing, Washington, and Tokyo. State-run Xinhua released a detailed readout hours before Trump posted his summary to Truth Social, an inversion in the typical communications choreography suggesting Beijing's desire to shape the narrative early. According to the state-run Xinhua, Xi used the call to, quote, elucidate China's principled position on the Taiwan question, end quote, stressing that Taiwan's return to China remains integral to the, quote, post-war international order, end quote. The readout framed the issue in sweeping historical terms, invoking World War II and the, quote, fruits of victory, end quote, that both countries should safeguard together. Trump, in Xinhua's telling, praised Xi as, quote, a great leader, end quote, agreed with China's views on bilateral relations and acknowledged China's wartime contribution. He also reportedly affirmed US understanding of Taiwan's importance to Beijing. Trump's own account made no mention of Taiwan or historical framing. Instead, he highlighted discussions on Ukraine, Russia, fentanyl, and agricultural trade, noting that Xi invited him to Beijing in April next year and plans to visit the United States next year too. According to the US-based Wall Street Journal, while Xi pressed Taiwan, Trump steered the call toward Ukraine as Washington and Kiev edge closer to potential peace talks. The timing of Xi's message comes as Beijing escalates pressure on Japan following remarks by Tokyo's Takaichi about Japan's role in a Taiwan contingency, a moment one senior Trump-aligned figure described to US-based Politico as, quote, a golden opportunity, end quote, for China to constrain Japanese policy discourse. Analysts in Tokyo fear the prospect of a US-China so-called grand bargain that sidelines Japanese interests, even as Trump weighs loosening restrictions on Nvidia's advanced AI chip exports to China. Today, however, Tuesday morning Japanese time, Japan's Prime Minister Takaichi said she spoke with the US President on a call at his request, and that he briefed her on his phone call with Xi Jinping. She said that the two reaffirmed the importance of close cooperation. Takaichi added that Trump told her she could call him any time, and she gave her thoughts on the US efforts on achieving peace in Ukraine. Now we'll move to Japan-China attention specifically, the main focus of today's episode shortly. But first, we cover this observation made by veteran China analyst Bill Bishop today. Quote, Taiwan and Japan leaders may be justified in being nervous about this discussion in the absence of more information about what the two leaders really said about Taiwan and Japan, assuming the current PRC tempest over Prime Minister Takaichi's comments came up. Xi asking for this call could be a sign that he is trying to shape Trump's reaction to the growing PRC-Japan crisis. So far, Trump and the White House have not weighed in publicly on the current PRC-Japan tensions. US officials have said repeatedly they expect to sign the latest US-China trade deal by Thanksgiving, which is this Thursday. And the PRC is behind on its promised purchases of soybeans. Perhaps Xi also wanted to squeeze Trump for a little more before closing their deal, say around Nvidia H200 chips for soybeans, end quote. Okay, we now cover salient updates to the ongoing Japan-China diplomatic crisis, which we've been covering for a few weeks now, and which seem to escalate by the day. China has sharply escalated its diplomatic offensive against Japan, formally writing the United Nations that it will, quote, resolutely exercise its right of self-defense, end quote, should Tokyo intervene militarily in a Taiwan Strait contingency. The rare policy move, delivered in writing to the UN Secretary-General by China's permanent representative to the body, Fu Cong, is the latest and most visible step in a spiraling confrontation that now stretches across military posturing, diplomatic recriminations, economic retaliation, and hardening public opinion on both sides. Fu's letter, now set to be circulated as an official UN General Assembly document, accuses the Japanese Prime Minister of committing an, quote, act of aggression, end quote, for openly suggesting that a Taiwan Strait crisis could trigger Japan's deployment of troops under its collective self-defense framework. Quote, if Japan dares to intervene militarily in the Taiwan Strait situation, China will resolutely exercise its right of self-defense under the UN Charter and international law, safeguarding its national sovereignty and territorial integrity, end quote. Beijing is basically saying, if we move on Taiwan and Japan mobilizes in response, this is an act of aggression against China, and China is in its full rights to defend itself. Japan pushed back hard, with Japanese ambassador to the UN, Katsuyuki Yamazaki, submitting, quote, Japan's fundamental defense policy is a posture of passive defense strategy, which is exclusively defense-oriented, contrary to the Chinese side's claims. End quote. As regular viewers know, Beijing's warning comes after the Prime Minister of Japan became the first sitting leader of the country to explicitly link Taiwan's security to Japan's own, a shift from the strategic ambiguity maintained by her predecessors. Though she later told Parliament that she would refrain from specifying scenarios for troop deployment, she has refused to retract her earlier comments and insists Japan's overall policy remains unchanged. China's reaction has been sweeping. Foreign Minister Wang Yi described Takaichi's remarks as shocking, vowing that Beijing must resolutely hit back. Economic reprisals followed, alongside an orchestrated surge of state media commentary portraying Japan as, quote, attempting to resurrect militarism, end quote, and, quote, break free from the post-war system, end quote. Several Chinese outlets and commentators have gestured, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, toward the controversial enemy state clauses in the UN Charter, which theoretically allow enforcement actions against former Axis powers without prior Security Council approval. The Japanese Foreign Ministry quickly moved to neutralize that narrative, posting a reminder on X over the weekend that the UN General Assembly declared the enemy state clauses obsolete in 1995, with China voting in favor. For some analysts, Beijing's UN letter fits into a pattern of so-called lawfare, using international legal instruments to legitimize strategic objectives. Others worry it may be part of a broader effort to prepare diplomatic ground for military measures if the crisis intensifies. Meanwhile, Tokyo is taking these war threats seriously. Military activity around Japan's southwestern islands continues to build. Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi reaffirmed during a weekend visit to army bases on Yonaguni and Ishigaki, the islands closest to Taiwan, that plans to station medium-range surface-to-air missiles are, quote, steadily progressing, end quote. Yonaguni, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan, is rapidly emerging as a key node in Japan's defense posture. Chinese military commander Song Zhongping warned in a Global Times piece that Japan's deployments reflect an, quote, ill-intended agenda, end quote, and risk, quote, provoking regional tensions, end quote. The United States is also expanding its footprint. Over the past 2 months, the U.S. Marine Corps has been shuttling equipment through Yonaguni's Kubura port, turning the island into an emerging anchor for the first island chain strategy. American officials frame the shipments as logistical readiness and disaster response preparation, though the timing underscores increased trilateral defense coordination. The diplomatic dispute has begun radiating outward. Hong Kong's chief executive John Lee publicly and unsurprisingly backed Beijing's stance and confirmed the city had suspended official exchanges with Japan's consulate amid the feud. Yet in Japan, the political mood appears to be hardening in the other direction. A Kyodo poll found Takaichi's approval rating rising nearly 6 points after the confrontation began, with almost half of respondents supporting Japan's right to collective self-defense in a Taiwan crisis. Chinese commentators say the standoff reflects deeper structural shifts. According to Zhu Feng of Nanjing University, quote, Japan has made it very clear that China is the greatest strategic threat it has ever faced, end quote. And this is accurate in modern history at least. Fudan University's Wu Xianbo said the conservative forces have dominated Japanese politics since 2012, driving a more confrontational China policy. For Beijing, this represents a, quote, long-term struggle, end quote, as Japan's foreign and security policy continues drifting rightward. Of course, commentators outside of China argue that it is an increasingly assertive China which has threatened the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. With both governments digging in and military activity around Taiwan accelerating, the China-Japan relationship appears to be entering its most volatile phase in decades, with the Taiwan Strait at the center of an increasingly dangerous strategic contest. We may well be living history here, and we will be following this diplomatic crisis as it unfolds day by day. If you want to be on top of these developments as they happen through grounded and sober analysis, consider subscribing to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, and you will have them as they're released. If you're getting some value from today's episode, it's a huge help if you hit the like button, and Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Next up, and on the theme of the wider geopolitical contest, we now move to Russia, China relations. Chinese exporters have sharply increased the prices they charge Russia for goods with potential military uses, taking advantage of Moscow's growing dependency on Chinese supply chains as Western sanctions restrict access to critical components, new research shows. According to a study by the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, BOFIT, the average price of export-controlled items shipped from China to Russia jumped 87% between 2021 and 2024, compared with a rise of just 9% for similar exports to other destinations. The findings suggest that while Russia has tapped Chinese shipments to sidestep Western restrictions imposed after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin is paying a steep premium to do so. One analyst even went so far as to observe that it must feel like being stabbed in the back. A senior Western sanctions official told the UK-based Financial Times that although the goal remains to sever Russia's military-industrial complex from international supply networks, Chinese firms, quote, ripping them off, end quote, represents a, quote, pretty good outcome, end quote. An 80% price increase, the official said, effectively halves Russia's purchasing power. The researchers focused on the category of machinery and mechanical appliances, a broad class of goods that includes many of the components critical to Russia's weapons production. They found that sanctions have constrained Russia's technological base by making essential imports significantly more expensive. In several cases, higher import values were driven entirely by price hikes rather than increased volumes. Ball bearing imports from China, for example, rose 76% in dollar terms between 2021 and 2024, even as shipment volumes fell 13%. The authors note that the inflationary impact of sanctions appears to be intensifying, likely due to tightening enforcement, enabling exporters to demand higher risk premiums. Sanctions relief remains a central Russian objective. A recent draft peace framework proposed by the US states that lifting sanctions would be negotiated in stages. Beijing, meanwhile, continues to deny supplying lethal aid to Moscow and rejects unilateral sanctions that constrains Chinese-Russian commerce. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. I'm sorry if it was quite heavy, but we had to cover these updates and we will continue to cover them as they develop. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I hope to see you for the next episode, which will either be tomorrow or on Thursday.